When Jordan Carter stepped into the packed courthouse that morning, he had no idea he was about to face one of the most pivotal moments of his career. He wasn't there as the respected federal prosecutor with a decade of wins under his belt. No, today, he was just a man standing up for what was right, and what unfolded inside that courtroom would leave everyone questioning what they thought they knew about justice. Stay tuned, because this story will make you think twice about fairness in our legal system. Jordan Carter was no stranger to courtrooms. As one of the youngest federal prosecutors in the Southern District, he had taken down criminals, exposed corruption, and fought tirelessly for justice. But today, standing in a modest municipal courthouse in Fairview, Alabama, he wasn't here for work. He was here for something personal. His late mother's home, the modest two-bedroom house where he grew up, had been hit with an inexplicable property tax hike. It was the kind of mistake that could go unnoticed in the piles of bureaucracy. But for Jordan, it was more than numbers on a spreadsheet. That house was his anchor, a symbol of his roots and everything his mother had worked so hard to give him. He had all the evidence in hand, neatly organized in a folder, confident the case would be straightforward. But as he walked into courtroom B, something about the air felt off. Judge Henry Wallace, presiding for over 3 decades, was known for his no-nonsense demeanor. His tall frame, piercing gray eyes, and deep Southern drawl made him a commanding presence. But beneath that surface was a reputation few dared to speak about openly, a legacy of biased rulings that left many feeling silenced and defeated. Jordan found a seat near the back, flipping through his documents one last time. The room buzzed with the nervous energy of small claims disputes, minor infractions, and property issues. People shuffled papers and exchanged quiet whispers. As the minutes ticked by, Jordan noticed a pattern. Late arrivals, mostly white defendants, entered the room without a word from the judge. One even spilled coffee as he stumbled to his seat. No reprimand, no fine. Just a quick glance from the bench and business as usual. Then the clock struck 10:15, and Jordan's name echoed through the courtroom. He adjusted his tie, grabbed his folder, and approached the podium with confidence. "Mr. Carter," Judge Wallace began, his tone sharp and cutting. "You're late." Jordan frowned slightly. "Your Honor, I arrived 15 minutes before the docket began, and have been waiting in the courtroom." The judge's expression hardened. "This court values its time, Mr. Carter. I'm issuing a fine of $1,000 for contempt." The words hit like a hammer. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jordan inhaled deeply, his legal instincts telling him to stay calm. But the injustice was glaring. He couldn't ignore it. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "may I ask why this fine is being issued to me when other late arrivals have not been penalized in the same manner?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the judge, whose jaw tightened. "Are you questioning this court's authority, Mr. Carter?" Jordan stood his ground, his heart pounding. "Not the authority, Your Honor. The consistency." The tension in the room was palpable. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing this wasn't just another routine case. Something larger was brewing. "Enough," the judge snapped, slamming his gavel. "Your fine stands. Present your case or step down." Jordan nodded, biting back the words he wanted to say. He laid out his argument about the property tax error with precision, but his mind was already racing. This wasn't just about him. This was about something much bigger, a system that seemed broken at its core. As he returned to his seat, Jordan made a quiet decision. He wasn't going to let this go. This was only the beginning. What would you have done in Jordan's position? Have you ever felt like the odds were stacked against you in a place that's supposed to be fair? Comment. 2 feet if you liked it, 7 feet if you didn't, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from elderly wisdom. Jordan Carter sat in the back of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the proceedings before him. Case after case was called, but he wasn't merely observing. He was analyzing, dissecting, and uncovering a pattern that grew more glaring with each passing minute. A young black man stood before the bench, his tie slightly askew. Judge Wallace scowled. "You couldn't bother to dress properly for court?" he snapped. "It's a matter of respect. $50 fine." The man stammered an apology, but the gavel came down, dismissing him. Minutes later, a white woman entered, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She fidgeted nervously as she stepped forward, but Judge Wallace barely glanced at her attire. He heard her out, his tone even and measured, and let her off with a warning. Jordan's pen moved swiftly across his notebook. The disparity wasn't subtle, it was stark, deliberate, and systemic. Each case added a layer to the growing picture of injustice, and Jordan could feel the weight of what he was uncovering pressing heavily on his shoulders. The courtroom's recessed hum broke when Lisa Thompson, the court's clerk, approached him. She moved cautiously, her demeanor betraying the years she had spent blending into the background. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Mr. Carter," she began, her eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "I've seen you taking notes. I just wanted to say you're not imagining things." Jordan glanced up at her, intrigued but cautious. "Go on." Lisa hesitated, wringing her hands. "Judge Wallace, he's been here a long time, too long. Everyone knows how he runs things, but no one says anything. It's dangerous to question him." Jordan's gaze sharpened. "What have you seen?" Lisa pressed her lips together, as if debating whether to continue. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. She hesitated, then handed it to him. "I've been keeping this," she said quietly. "Every time something didn't sit right with me, I wrote it down. Dates, names, cases. You might find it useful." Jordan opened the notebook, his eyes scanning the pages. Each entry was a testament to the bias that had infected this courtroom for years. Cases of minorities receiving harsher sentences than their white counterparts for identical infractions. Fines that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino defendants. Decisions that reeked of prejudice and favoritism. The enormity of it hit him like a tidal wave. Lisa had just handed him the missing piece he hadn't realized he needed. A damning record that could shine a light on the injustice Judge Wallace had tried so hard to keep in the shadows. Jordan met Lisa's eyes. "This is invaluable. Thank you." Her face softened with relief, but there was still fear in her voice. "Be careful, Mr. Carter. People around here don't like change, and they don't like people who try to make it happen." Jordan nodded, slipping the notebook into his briefcase. "I know the risks, but this isn't something I can ignore." As Lisa walked away, Jordan's resolve solidified. This wasn't just about his fine or his mother's house anymore. This was about exposing the rot in a system that prided itself on fairness while quietly perpetuating injustice. He had fought against criminals and corrupt officials before, but this battle was different. It wasn't in the shadows, it was in the very heart of a place meant to uphold the law, and he wasn't about to back down. Jordan left the courthouse that day not with closure, but with a mission. He drove back to his office, his mind racing as he began outlining his plan. The evidence was there, but now he needed to build the case, and he knew just where to start. Jordan Carter's office was dimly lit as the evening settled over Fairview. The sounds of traffic outside faded into the background as he spread Lisa Thompson's notebook across his desk alongside court records he had requested. Earlier that day, the pieces were beginning to fit together, and the pattern that emerged was staggering. He flipped through the notebook again. Every entry was meticulous, detailing the race, gender, and outcomes of cases Judge Wallace had presided over. It was a chronicle of injustice, a record of years of biased rulings and systemic discrimination. But a notebook wasn't enough. Jordan needed corroboration, witnesses, and undeniable evidence to build a case that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or personal vendetta. He pulled out his laptop and began typing a list of people to contact: former defendants, attorneys who had argued in Wallace's court, and even the courthouse staff who might have seen too much over the years to stay silent. The next morning, Jordan's investigation began in earnest. He started with Tom Andrews, a local attorney who had represented dozens of clients in municipal court. Tom was hesitant at first, but as Jordan shared some of the patterns he'd uncovered, The older man's demeanor softened. "I've been practicing in this town for over 20 years, Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "And yeah, I've seen it. Wallace doesn't even try to hide it. Black defendants? Always find more, always talked down to. It's not right, but what can you do? He's untouchable around here." "Not anymore," Jordan replied firmly. "I'm building a case and I need your help." Tom nodded slowly, the weight of years of silent frustration evident in his expression. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll see what I can dig up." Jordan's next stop was the community center in Fairview's predominantly black neighborhood. He held an impromptu meeting with locals, many of whom had been on the receiving end of Wallace's rulings. Their stories poured out, fines they couldn't afford, sentences that seemed harsher than the crime, and the humiliation of being treated like second-class citizens in a system that was supposed to protect them. An older man named Samuel Briggs spoke with quiet conviction. "I've been to that courtroom more times than I'd like to admit," he said, his voice steady. "And every time it felt like the outcome was decided before I even opened my mouth." Another voice chimed in, a young mother clutching her toddler. "He fined me $500 for parking too close to a fire hydrant, but my neighbor, who's white, parked in the same spot last month and got off with a warning. It's not fair, and it's not right." Jordan listened carefully, taking notes and gathering contact information. The stories were harrowing, but they were also consistent, a damning testament to the inequality that had gone unchecked for far too long. Back at his office, Jordan's phone buzzed. It was Lisa Thompson. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice urgent, "I thought you should know. Word's getting around about what you're doing. People are talking. Some folks are on your side, but others, well, they're not happy." Jordan's jaw tightened. He knew the risks of taking on someone as entrenched as Judge Wallace. Wallace wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol of the old guard, a man whose influence reached far beyond the courtroom. "I appreciate the warning, Lisa," Jordan said. "But I'm not stopping. This isn't just about me or my case. This is about justice, for everyone." That evening, Jordan received an email from a young law student named Maya Green, who had been in the courtroom the day he was fined. She had been taking notes for her class and had captured key moments that corroborated Jordan's observations. Attached to the email was her detailed report, complete with timestamps and summaries of each case she had witnessed that morning. Maya's account was invaluable. It painted a clear picture of bias, supported not just by memory but by precise documentation. Jordan replied immediately, thanking her for her courage and asking if she would be willing to testify if needed. The turning point came a week later, when Jordan sat down with James Porter, a retired bailiff who had worked in Judge Wallace's courtroom for over 15 years. James had stayed silent for most of his career, but now, with nothing to lose, he was ready to speak out. "I saw things I didn't agree with," James admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But back then, I was afraid. I needed the job. I told myself it wasn't my place to question the judge. But seeing what you're doing, it gives me hope. If you're willing to fight, I'll back you up." With James's testimony, Lisa's notebook, and a growing list of witnesses, Jordan's case began to take shape. But he knew the fight was far from over. Judge Wallace's power didn't just come from his position, it came from the network of influence he had built over decades. Taking him down would require not just evidence, but strategy. Late that night, as Jordan reviewed his notes, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about exposing one man's prejudice. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed it to flourish. And for that, he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The battle lines were drawn, and Jordan knew there was no turning back. The question now was not whether he could build the case, but whether he could withstand the pressure that was about to come his way. The courtroom was silent as Jordan Carter walked through its double doors. This time, he wasn't here to argue about property taxes or fines. He was here for something far bigger, something that could shake the foundations of Fairview's judicial system. His every step echoed in the room, each one steady and deliberate, as though he were preparing for battle. At the front of the room, Judge Henry Wallace sat high on the bench, his usual stern expression slightly clouded with tension. Word of Jordan's investigation had spread, and Wallace was no fool. He could feel the weight of eyes on him now. The courtroom wasn't just filled with defendants and clerks today. There were reporters in the back, legal observers in the middle rows, and even members of the Judicial Review Commission scattered throughout. As the proceedings began, Jordan stood. "Your Honor," he started, his voice firm but measured, "before this court addresses the cases on today's docket, I respectfully request permission to present evidence of systemic misconduct in this courtroom." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Judge Wallace's gaze darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Mr. Carter, this court does not entertain baseless accusations." Jordan held his ground. "Your Honor, these are not accusations. They are documented patterns of bias and discrimination, supported by witness testimony, court records, and first-hand accounts." Wallace leaned forward, his voice cold. "You are out of line, Mr. Carter. I suggest you tread carefully." But Jordan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, holding up Lisa Thompson's notebook. "For years, your decisions have disproportionately penalized Black and Latino defendants. This notebook, kept by your own court clerk, details case after case where fines and sentences were unequally distributed. And it's not just her testimony. Former defendants, attorneys, and even your own staff have corroborated these patterns." Wallace's face reddened. "This is outrageous," he snapped, his gavel slamming down. "You are attempting to undermine this court with hearsay and personal vendettas." Jordan met the judge's fury with calm resolve. "What I'm attempting to do is uphold the principles this court claims to stand for: fairness, equality, and justice." The room was electric. Reporters scribbled furiously, and spectators leaned forward, their breaths held in anticipation. Jordan turned to the rows of people behind him, gesturing toward a familiar face. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness, Lisa Thompson." The courtroom doors opened, and Lisa walked in, her steps hesitant but determined. She took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Judge Wallace glared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. Lisa's voice was quiet at first, but it grew steadier as she spoke. "I've worked in this courtroom for over 15 years, she began, "and I've seen patterns that I couldn't ignore. Defendants of color are fined more, reprimanded more harshly, and rarely given the same leniency as others. I started keeping notes because I couldn't stand by and watch it happen anymore." Jordan handed her the notebook. "Can you confirm that these entries reflect your observations?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, every word." As Lisa stepped down, Jordan called his next witness, James Porter, the retired bailiff. James's testimony was just as damning. "I worked under Judge Wallace for years," he said, "and I saw how he treated people differently, depending on who they were. It was wrong, but back then, I didn't have the courage to speak up. I'm speaking up now because it's long overdue." Judge Wallace's composure began to crack. His usual commanding presence was replaced by visible discomfort, and his attempts to interrupt were met with objections sustained by a visiting judicial monitor. The turning point came when Jordan presented court records that revealed undeniable disparities. He displayed 2 cases side by side on a projector for the room to see. "In this case," Jordan explained, "a white defendant with 3 parking violations was fined $50. In this case, a black defendant with 1 violation was fined $500. Both were heard by Judge Wallace on the same day." Gasps filled the room as Jordan continued to outline case after case, each one painting a picture of systemic bias. "This isn't a coincidence," he concluded. "This is a pattern, and it's a pattern that must end." By the time Jordan rested his case, the courtroom was in an uproar. Spectators whispered to one another, and the reporters were already typing furiously on their laptops. Judge Wallace sat in stony silence, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The presiding judicial monitor, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, finally spoke. "This court will recess while we review the evidence presented today. Further action will be determined based on our findings." The gavel fell, and the room erupted into murmurs as people began filing out. Jordan remained seated for a moment, his heart pounding. He had done what he came to do, but the fight was far from over. As Jordan stepped out into the courthouse steps, he was met with a swarm of cameras and reporters shouting questions. He didn't stop to answer. Instead, he made his way to a small group of community members who had gathered outside, many of whom had shared their stories with him. "We're with you, Mr. Carter," an older man said, gripping Jordan's hand. "You've given us hope." Jordan nodded, his voice steady despite the whirlwind around him. "This is just the beginning, but together we'll see this through." In the days that followed, the evidence Jordan presented spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and Fairview became the epicenter of a growing conversation about bias in the judicial system. Judge Wallace, once untouchable, found himself at the center of a formal investigation. But for Jordan, this wasn't about bringing down one man. It was about rebuilding a broken system. And as he prepared for the next phase of the battle, he knew that change was finally within reach. The courthouse in Fairview was quieter than usual in the weeks that followed Jordan Carter's explosive testimony. Judge Henry Wallace, once the unchallenged figure of authority in that room, had been suspended pending a full investigation. His towering presence was replaced by a judicial review panel tasked with examining years of his rulings. For the people of Fairview, the tide was turning. But for Jordan, the fight was far from over. Back in his office, Jordan was poring over new court records. The revelations from Lisa Thompson's notebook had opened the floodgates. Defendants and attorneys from across the state were coming forward with their own stories, adding more weight to the case against Wallace. Each account painted a picture of not just one judge's bias, but a system that had quietly allowed it to thrive. Jordan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at him. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a call from Julia Harris, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Jordan," she said, her tone brisk but warm, "the Judicial Review Commission is moving forward. They've called for a formal inquiry into Wallace's rulings. It's going to be public, and they want you to testify." Jordan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll be there. This isn't just about Wallace anymore. It's about setting a precedent." Julia hesitated. "You've done incredible work, but you need to prepare yourself. Wallace has allies, and they won't let this go without a fight." "I know," Jordan replied, his voice steady. "But I didn't start this to back down now." The day of the inquiry arrived, and the courthouse was packed once again. This time, the audience included not just reporters and community members, but legal experts and civil rights advocates from across the state. The panel of judicial commissioners sat at the front, their expressions grave as they reviewed the stacks of evidence Jordan and his team had compiled. Jordan took the stand, the weight of the moment pressing down on him but not breaking him. He recounted his observations, the testimonies of witnesses like Lisa Thompson and James Porter, and the undeniable patterns in the court records. He spoke with clarity and passion, laying bare the systemic bias that had festered in Fairview's municipal court for decades. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, one of the commissioners, an older woman with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, "what do you believe should happen next?" Jordan met her eyes. "What needs to happen is more than just holding one man accountable. We need reforms, real, structural changes that ensure this never happens again. Transparency in sentencing, independent oversight, and mandatory training to address implicit bias. Because justice isn't justice if it's not applied equally." The inquiry lasted several days, and by the end, the panel reached its conclusion. The findings were damning. Judge Wallace had systematically discriminated against defendants of color, issuing disproportionately harsh penalties and fines. The evidence was undeniable, and the commission recommended his permanent removal from the bench. But the resolution didn't stop there. The panel called for statewide reforms, including the implementation of new checks and balances in municipal courts. Wallace's case became a catalyst for a broader movement, sparking investigations into other judges and courtrooms across the state. For Jordan, the victory was bittersweet. He had exposed the truth and sparked change, but the fight had come at a cost. The scrutiny, the sleepless nights, and the emotional toll of reliving countless stories of injustice weighed heavily on him. But as he walked out of the courthouse that final day, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters, people who had been inspired by his courage to speak out. Among them was Samuel Briggs, the older man who had shared his story at the community center weeks before. "You did it," Samuel said, shaking Jordan's hand firmly. "You gave us a voice." Jordan smiled, his exhaustion momentarily lifting. It wasn't just me, it was all of us. In the months that followed, Fairview began to change. New judges were appointed, chosen for their commitment to fairness and equality. Court personnel underwent mandatory training to address bias, and an independent oversight committee was established to review sentencing disparities. Lisa Thompson was promoted to a leadership role within the courthouse, where she implemented new procedures to ensure accountability. James Porter began speaking at community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for what was right. And Jordan? He returned to his work as a federal prosecutor, but his focus shifted. He took on cases that targeted systemic inequities, using the momentum from Fairview to push for broader reforms. 1 year after the inquiry, Jordan stood on the steps of the newly renovated courthouse in Fairview, where a plaque had been installed near the entrance. It read, "Justice for all is justice for each. May this courthouse always uphold the principles of fairness, equality, and dignity." As he read the words, a young law student approached him, a woman with a notebook tucked under her arm and determination in her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story is the reason I decided to go into law." Jordan smiled, the weight of the past year giving way to hope for the future. "Then remember this," he said. "The law isn't just about rules, it's about people. And it's up to all of us to make sure it serves them the way it should." With that, he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the path. A reminder that justice is not a destination, but a journey, one that requires courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that change is always possible. Thank you for watching Jordan's incredible journey to justice. What do you think? Could you have taken a stand like he did? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And don't forget to hit subscribe to join our elderly wisdom community for more stories that inspire and connect us all. Together, let's keep the conversation going. See you in the next story.